Good morning, everyone. My name is Gordon Nabok. I'm the editor-in-chief of Volume 22 of the Minnesota Journal of National Law, and I'd like to echo Allison's sentiment this morning and thank you all for coming here on this beautiful Minnesota morning. I'd like to first introduce Dean David Wippman, our robotics panel moderator. David Wippman is the Dean of the Law School and William S. Patty Professor of Law, and he's a recognized authority in international law. He's taught public international law, international criminal law, international human rights, and ethnic conflict. He received his B.A. summa cum laude from Princeton University in 1976, his M.A. through a fellowship in the graduate program in English literature at Yale University, and his J.D. from Yale Law School. While at Yale, he was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, and then he clerked for the Honorable Wilfred Feinberg, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Dean Wippman joined the law school in July 2008, and he is, before that, he was the Associate Dean at Cornell Law School, where he served as the director of the National Security Council, Office of Multilateral and Humanitarian Affairs, where he worked on war crime issues, the International Criminal Court, economic sanctions, and UN political issues. And without further ado, Dean David Wippman.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Is this working? Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning. Thanks for the tech support. Welcome to the symposium. I want to congratulate the editors of the International Law Journal for putting together a terrific program. You've probably noticed there were a few people outside who have different views on the program. And I want to remind everybody that we do have rules of decorum. They're posted outside, and individuals who may disagree with any of the views expressed today are welcome to attend and participate, provided, of course, that they've paid their $20 and don't in any way disrupt the proceedings. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end of this panel and at the end of the other panels. And by questions, I want to emphasize that I mean questions, not prepared and lengthy statements, but we do want to get questions for our panelists. We're very fortunate this morning. We have an outstanding group of panelists. They have a great deal in common. Among other things, they're all very well-known experts in this field. All of them have law degrees from a small, little-known law school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think we have 2 JDs from Harvard and one with an LLM and SJD from Harvard. And I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and I guess we haven't actually discussed the order of presentation, but unless I hear a preference expressed, we'll go in alphabetical order for that as well. So our first panelist is Professor Ken Anderson. Ken is one of the country's leading authorities on the law of war and related issues. He's a professor at Washington College of Law at American University in Washington, D.C. He's a visiting fellow of the Hoover Institute and a member of its task force on national security and law, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Before he joined American University, he was the founding director of the Human Rights Watch Arms Division, and he was one of the people who initiated the landmines ban campaign. He was the first general counsel to the Open Society Institute with the Soros Foundations, and he is a prolific author and blogger. His most recent book is Living with the UN, American Responsibilities and International Order, just came out in 2012, and he has a new book with Brookings called Speaking the Law, the Obama Administration's Addresses on National Security Law. And I'm going to introduce our other 2 panelists as well, and then we'll go to the presentations. So next is Professor Oren Gross. Oren is a professor here at the University of Minnesota Law School. He's the Irving Younger Professor of Law, and he is also this year the Nomura Visiting Professor, and I emphasize visiting, in case there's any uncertainty about that to my right, the Nomura Visiting Professor of International Financial Systems at Harvard Law School. He was a member of the faculty of Tel Aviv University Law School from 1996 to 2002 and has held visiting positions at a wide range of other law schools and universities. He's received numerous academic awards, including a Fulbright Scholarship. Between 1986 and 1991, he served as a senior legal advisory officer in the International Law Branch of the Israeli Defense Forces Judge Advocate General Corps. And he was legal advisor to an Israeli delegation that negotiated an agreement with the Palestinian Authority's senior officials on economic aspects of a permanent status agreement between Israel and Palestine. And we have Professor John Radsan, who comes from William Mitchell College of Law across the river in St. Paul. He teaches comparative counterterrorism, constitutional law, and national security law, among other things. He is a former federal prosecutor and also former assistant general counsel at the CIA. And at William Mitchell, he's the director of the National Security Forum, which focuses on the balance between liberty and security in counterterrorism policies. He's often quoted by the media and periodically testifies before Congress on law of war and counterterrorism issues. He's consulted on projects with numerous countries, has taught here and abroad in a wide range of institutions, and has also served as a consultant to Search for Common Ground and the American-Iranian Council. So welcome to our three very distinguished panelists, and they're each going to speak for about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll have a moderated conversation followed by questions and answers. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Ken Anderson.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I feel like among the panelists, this is actually a fairly small community, and so it's always nice to see old friends and also all of you. So I'm delighted that people take an interest in these kinds of topics. We're talking this morning about robotics and warfare, and there is a sort of present-day aspect of that. A lot of the focus of that is really around drones and the sort of controversies that swirl around drones. And then there is a future aspect of this, the part that relates to sort of the evolution of technology and a series of questions that are partly arise out of drones and drone-like technology, that is, the remotely piloted vehicle. But then there is gradually a further set of questions that involve things that are related but also quite distinct, namely the question of autonomous lethal weapon systems, and generally speaking, the question of automation in war and automation on the battlefield. I'm going to try to bridge those two with a heavy emphasis on the second, namely on the sort of automation question and future questions, in keeping with the general sense I have of the symposium that it's looking to the future of war rather than concentrating so much on the present questions. But let me start out with one sort of stage setting point about drones and drone technology. Drones and drone technology are not autonomous in any sense. The nature of drone technology is that it's remotely piloted. There is a human pilot who is flying the thing who is simply not in the cockpit. And as a technological matter, that is transforming and will transform all of civil aviation, and the technologies that lie behind that are transforming vast parts of our industrial base and our transportation base. Google cars are on the horizon. We all are aware of this. So there are many, many changes coming through automation generally in these areas, and one of the questions would be, what are the implications of that for machines of war? And very specifically, what does that mean for weapons? Now, the debates that swirl around drones today are not really about the automation questions. The debates today about drones are, you have this platform that gives you certain kinds of capabilities. In one sense, they're not really different from any other air weapons platform. And to that extent, then drones don't really raise a sort of technology and the law of war question so much as they raise a question about their strategic use. Whether the ways in which they are used in their various functions, targeted killing, signature strikes, various kinds of things, whether those are lawfully justified under the laws of war. But they're not themselves raising radical new questions as a matter of sort of automation and war. Whereas I think that the interesting question for this discussion is, and then something that's looking to the future of war, is to sort of look beyond drones to the question of what happens when you generally start to automate all of these functions. And what happens when you finally reach the questions of technologies that are genuinely autonomous. All right, now we say autonomous, automation, what does all this stuff mean? Here is sort of a quick set of just one-line definitions. One could write a book about each of them, but the one-line definitions would be automation is the process by which one is applying some form of determinant algorithm to some form of system behavior. But in that case, there is no question about where the programming is supposed to arrive at in terms of the action that is being performed. True autonomy at the far end of this is defined as something where in sort of genuinely autonomous systems, the machine is actually making decisions that cannot necessarily be predicted in their outcomes at the front end. That is, there is genuine decision making going on that does not allow you to just predict automatically this will cycle through the algorithm and it will reach this result. Now, in practice, when it comes to weapons, we really don't mean that form of autonomy, at least in the stuff which is under consideration and sort of under design stuff at this point. So the U.S. military, the Department of Defense released back in November a directive on autonomy and weapon systems in which it defined autonomy and semi-autonomy in the following much more limited ways. It said an autonomous weapon system is one which is able to do two things. Once the system is switched on, so to speak, the system is able to both determine and select its own targets, so it has criteria for the selection of targets. And second, the system is able to independently and engage and attack those targets, including with criteria for whatever legal aspects have to be taken into account in that. So that there are two aspects then to autonomy as far as DoD is concerned in its sort of design requirements and the rest of that. There is the target selection part, and then there's the engagement with the target and the firing of the weapon part. If each of those is made independent in the sense that you flip on the machine and it takes care of that, then you have a fully autonomous system. And that same directive defines semi-autonomy as being one in which the human selects the target and in which once selected and given the authorization, the machine is then able to engage in some fashion. All right, so these are all quite different senses of autonomy, semi-autonomy, automation, and it's important to bear in mind as one sort of reads the literature in this area what's being driven at in this. Now, in this process then, the question is sort of where is this heading? And there are really two ways to look at this kind of weapons development process. One is that you reach to sort of the sci-fi world at the far end and ask oneself, what does the world look like if you were able to imagine that all of these technological changes take place? And then you ask yourself, what legal requirements would a system have to meet in order to be lawful at that point? And the answer to that is actually pretty straightforward in the laws of war. It has to meet a weapons review, as found in, say, Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, to show that the weapon is not indiscriminate and to show various features about the weapon itself. And second, its use still has to meet the standard law of war requirements that its use be within the meaning of distinction and discrimination, that it is able to identify and select and address only targets that are lawful targets. And second, that in doing so, it has to be able to do so in a proportional manner, namely that it has to be able to take civilian collateral damage into account in some fashion. Now, I have not the faintest idea whether any weapon system down the road will even begin to come close to that. I have no idea where technology is going to go over, say, the next 100 years. I have no idea what Google cars will look like 100 years from now, let alone anything like weapons. So I myself am actually quite agnostic as to the question of whether any weapon system will fulfill the requirements at the end of the day of the laws of war to be truly independent in that sense. I'm truly agnostic on that question. I also believe, however, that it would be a huge mistake not to be pursuing the possible benefits that arise out of automation of systems, even ones that never achieve that full promise, but nonetheless achieve vast amounts of better discrimination, target selection, the ability to precisely focus the use of force is actually a far better thing, even if you never reach that sort of far end where the thing is lawfully fully autonomous. Because I don't know what it's going to actually be able to achieve. And as with most of these technologies, as with self-driving cars, as with many other kinds of robotic technologies, I think that it would be a huge, huge mistake to wind up giving up the possible benefits of these things because one doesn't know where the technology might go. So one can be agnostic, as I am, about the question of whether these weapons will ever achieve anything like something that allows them to actually function independently on the battlefield. And I should note that I think that within the Department of Defense, I think they're entirely skeptical about this. But what they do see is the benefits of incremental automation in various kinds of ways that do wind up providing enormous benefits in terms of the precision of the use of force in warfare. So with that, let me wind up with one sort of final thought about this, which is that the regulation of this stuff has, at the far end, a clear legal standard. It's the same legal standard that we apply to all weapons, and it's the same legal standard that we apply to the use of all weapons. As automation proceeds, these weapon systems, in order to be lawfully deployed, will have to meet those standards. And in that way, I think that the right way to think about regulation of this stuff is on an incremental basis, and to understand that the technology does not suddenly become Skynet or the Terminator or Robocop or anything like that from one day to the next. These things are tiny incremental moves in which the automation takes place most often in some system where it does not obviously have any implications for weapons. Drones will gradually become more and more automated because we already have problems with things like the landing of the drones. The best way to fix certain problems on the landing of the drones is to automate those landing functions. It has nothing to do with weapons. As, however, these platforms speed up in their use, as the rest of the system becomes more automated, at some point the integrated weapon function will become more automated as well. The legal reviews have to be taking place at each stage along that way in order to ensure that one doesn't have unintended consequences and that sort of the lawfulness of the system is preserved in that. But you notice that what I'm emphasizing here is that although there is sort of a uniform legal standard for all of this, it's something that has to be applied incrementally at each stage along the design, research, development, the sort of pushing of it forward in order to ensure that one has a lawful system at every step along the way. And that would then be my final and closing point, is that I think that we are actually not well served at this point by thinking, as is so often the case in the sort of the punditry and the commentary and the popular stuff written in the newspapers and the rest. Frankly, the current thing that's on the cover of Time magazine, the drones are here, what happens when they are unleashed, says the cover, upon domestic life in America. Well, I'm not sure that's actually really quite the question, but I don't think that we're actually served by Robocop imagery. What we have is a series of highly discrete changes that look like small automating changes, and those are the things that have to be focused on in extremely granular legal reviews as to their lawfulness, and that it's better to, in some sense, skip the sci-fi and actually focus on the small incremental changes taking place in automation today. David, thank you.
Ken, thank you very much. And our next panelist is Professor Oren Gross.
Thanks, David.
Here.
So we're talking about modern technology, and obviously kind of old-style technology is a bit of a problem. So I want to follow up on, on Ken's notes, but take a step back in order to move forward. We are at the gates of a new revolution or a new age, and that is the age of robotics. And it's much less sci-fi than people tend to assume. We already, many of us, live with robots that do chores at home, vacuum cleaners. The Roomba is probably the paradigm of this. We have robots on manufacturing floors. We have robots in medical services, either as nurse assistants that bring around medications, to robots that now perform surgeries. Not obviously the robot itself performs surgery, but the doctor is using a robot in order to perform surgery. So, for example, the robot allows any light, small tremors in the hands to be canceled, the same way that we have in our cameras, kind of this shake controls. Ken mentioned the transportation robots, if you will, the Google car, when it's quite clear, if you think about this, that those cars are more likely in the not-so-distant future to be safer than cars driven by us humans. We have assistive and socially interactive robots that are used not so much in this country, but in others, to care for the elderly, and also as babysitters. That already exists, as some sort of a human replacement companionship. There are developments in developing nanobots, small robots that can actually operate, among other things, for medical purposes inside human body. There is work that is being done on what the Trekkies would call cyborgs. Again, sounds very sci-fi, but I'll give you an example in a minute. Some sort of an interaction between the bio and the silicon. And of course, there are the war bots, or the warrior robots. And one of the issues, one of the many issues with this, is the dual use purposes. Many of the things that might get us to feel queasy about robotics in warfare are things that we hail as wonderful advancements when they are done outside. So to give one example, there is work being done on a helmet that will sit on the head of drone operators and basically tap into the subconscious or unconscious. The idea is that research has shown that frequently we identify individuals, or in this case we identify targets, long before we actually understand that we identify them. So if you can tap, if you can basically check brain waves, you can identify a target milliseconds, split seconds before you actually understand that you identify the target. And then maybe a kill command is sent to the drone. All right? So now that's really scary. That means that basically there might be, at some point in the future, a kill order that was not done by any human being with full awareness. That is troubling. At the same time, think about scenarios in which we basically allow individuals who suffer from tetraplegia to be able to move robotic arms or robotic legs just by the power of thought. And some of this already exists. That is obviously something that has a lot of potential. How do we navigate? How do we traverse this terrain between the scary stuff and the stuff that seems like giving hope to people? So I agree with Ken. I think that there is much, and popular literature and sci-fi literature takes us to places that are problematic, right? Whether we think of the Terminator on the one hand and R2-D2 on the other, and the truth is far from both of these. Now, with respect to warbots, because that's what we are talking about here, what I think is quite clear is that we are likely, and we already start seeing, but we are likely to see fundamental changes in the way in which wars are fought. We're going to see fundamental changes with respect to who populates the battle space or the battlefield. And in fact, we might even see changes in the meaning of what war is. If we have a scenario in which it's my robotic army against your robotic army, and individuals, humans, are not on the battlefield, that might actually change what we understand war to mean. Now, wars to this very day have always been a human affair. A human affair fought within the parameters of human understanding and human spheres. But this is moving further and further, or farther and farther away from us. If you think about cyber warfare as one example, and certainly when we are talking about autonomous weapons. Now, when you look at development of weapons in general, and I'll say a word also about the notion of whether or not these are weapons, right? When you look about a development of weapons, there is a certain theme that goes from the very first days of weaponry to today. And that is a theme of distancing. Weapons, by and large, are designed to create and to increase the distance between warriors and among warriors, both horizontally. We're getting further and further away from the target that we may kill, and even vertically. I mean, if you think about horses and elephants and planes and drones that lift you, literally lift you above the battlefield, right? Artillery. Whether you think about archers, whether you think about artillery, whether you think about drones, all of these are designed to increase distance. However, until today, by and large, even with distance increasing, we still had human beings somewhere, right, in the battlefield, if battlefield is understood writ large, right? Whether they are sitting in Nevada can still be seen as human beings in the loop, in the battlefield, pressing the trigger or giving the command to the drone to fire. This is changing. This is changing if, in fact, we're getting to a situation of autonomous robotic systems in which human beings might not at all be in the loop. Right? And now, when we talk here about the loop, it's important to understand that the notion of being in the loop is now a term of art in military strategy. There is this notion of the OODA loop, OODA, right, which is designed basically to streamline our thought process. We need to observe, to understand what's going on, and eventually to act. But the problem is that we human beings, right, when you're thinking about a battlefield where threats are coming in extremely fast, where the information that we need to process is extremely complex, right, and time is shrinking, we are the weakest link in this loop. And so it's not entirely surprising that we see two attempts or two strains of innovation. One strain of innovation is trying to basically build better soldiers. Again, I know this sounds very sci-fi, right? But let me give you some examples. So taking soldiers and building on the human platform, be it with the invention of what is known as the Iron Man suit, the exoskeleton, something that allows you to run faster and longer, to lift heavy weights, mechanisms that are designed to intervene with your need to sleep or with your need to consume food, mechanisms that apply neuroscience that are trying to target such things as your emotions, fear or trauma, right? And in a sense, maybe even cause personality change. All of these are obviously highly problematic, right? And lawyers need to have a lot to say about them. But regardless of how you think about those, right? And this is maybe, again, going back to the cyborgs issue, there's a limit that is determined by human physiology, right? And by the capacity of the human brain. And so the other strand is towards removing, now no longer distancing, but removing human beings entirely from battle space and saying we cannot, right, in any shape or form actually take credible, meaningful decisions in real time, right? And we need to delegate and maybe relegate, it depends also on your perspective, those decisions to other autonomous systems. Now, the more we go to there, right, the more we get to that end, there are questions that we need to ask ourselves, right, when we're moving to this kind of dehumanized, post-humanized phase of war, right? And I want to throw out some of those, and hopefully we can have more discussion about them. One is the desire to move, and we need to understand this, regardless of how we lawyers think about this. The desire to move to autonomous systems is clear, it's present, and in a sense, kind of the train has left the station. Right? If you think about minimizing risk to your own soldiers, which is one of the reasons, for example, for the deployment of drones, right? The same reason applies, or the same reason is on steroids when you're talking about autonomous systems, right? When there is no risk whatsoever, right, to individuals, or at least to your soldiers. Again, what does that mean when you can engage in warfare when your side has very little risk? Does that mean that countries may be more willing or more easily susceptible to going to start wars and less likely to end them if the cost in human life is minimized or even negated completely? Training. It's much easier to train the robot, right? Rather than individuals who need continuous training. Robots are trained once, and that's all you need to do, right? As opposed to fighter pilots who need continuous, ongoing training to remain in their full capacity. Robots also are not susceptible to emotions. You can train a soldier to be aware and complying with the laws of armed conflict. But when you put a young soldier on the battlefield and he or she is scared and worried and frightened, maybe even hysterical, we cannot be absolutely certain that they will perform to the level that we would expect them to perform. With robots, we know they're not afraid. Right? Hysteria is not a matter that is relevant to them. At the same time, emotions also have a positive side to them, whether it's compassion or otherwise. And robots will also not have that. Ken already mentioned issues of proportionality and even more so of discrimination. Will we be able to get to a situation where those robots will actually be able to discriminate, to distinguish a combatant from a non-combatant? Will they be able to tell a real weapon from a fake weapon, from a kid, I don't know what, wielding a plastic pistol? But then, of course, we also need to ask ourselves, are we capable of making those distinctions in real time when our sensors and actuators, our eyes, our hands, are not maybe as capable as those that we can equip robots with, right? And so all of this, right, brings us to issues of safety. How safe is it to deploy those autonomous systems? And I'm actually saying systems rather than weapons because it's not clear. They might be a weapon now, but you know, when we progress, there is a scenario in which we can say those systems are no longer a weapon. They are not like a gun or a knife. They are much more like an independent agent, right? Which also raises issues of responsibility and liability. What happens when those autonomous systems go berserk, or whether because they're hacked, or because of malfunction, or because of a virus, or because they were not programmed as well? Who's going to be liable for that? The programmer, the manufacturer, the commander who deployed them, the president as commander-in-chief, the robot itself? And what does that mean? Right? These are questions that we need to address. So with all of this, right, and I hope to have a discussion, I think all of these are questions that are out there, and the law as it currently stands, and again, I've been talking about the criminal issues of this, of responsibility and liability, is currently ill-equipped. We have, at the moment, a policy vacuum. technology is moving significantly faster than either policy or lawyers are able to follow. Thank you.
I consider the titles of these articles to be as important as the content, and I wonder whether we professors read the entire articles. So let me give you an example. In Mogadishu, we lost 19 American servicemen. If an academic had written a book about it, it would have been called something like An Unsuccessful American Intervention in the Horn of Africa, the loss of 19 American soldiers during a human rights aid and assistance mission. Maybe that's not sufficiently long, but if Mark Bowden wrote a book about it, it would be called Black Hawk Down. And when you write in that way, people will read your book, they will buy an option for a screenplay, and you will make money, and you will get attention. So with a co-author, I've written a few articles about armed drones. I had a sense of these issues, thankfully, from my work in the government. I said, well, let's try to get there out in front of the true experts, Ken Anderson or Oren Gross. Let's be the first one to mark a bit of this territory. So a couple years ago, I came up with a title, and I'm going to reserve it here. Ken, you can't take it. Oren, you can't take it. And the title will not have a colon, and it's going to be called Fully Automatic. I love the title, and I know that Kubrick, if he were alive, he would want to have one of his movies named Fully Automatic. And you can see the connections with Full Metal Jacket. So what do I have in mind about this? I am more out there. I believe that the technology is here and that the lawyers have not caught up with it. So I agree more with Oren, but I think there's a middle position here. Then we started the idea, and I had to convince my co-author that this was something legitimate for law review, and he gets frightened if nobody else has marked the territories. Well, that's all the more reason we should be there. Then a while ago, I noticed in following on SSRN and the various sites that Ken Anderson had beaten us to the territory. He had written something about lethal autonomous weapons, fully automatic weapons. I made a move at that point. I said, I'm not going to read this article at all. I'm jealous of Ken. This adds to my jealousy. And I'm going to be neutral. I want to continue tinkering with this idea. And in fact, my ignorance of the field will be complete. I'm going to make a decision not to read any of the literature about autonomous weapons that are written by lawyers or law professors. On the other hand, I didn't have much of a background in these sci-fi movies. I never had read an issue of Wired magazine. I said, I'm going to dig into this literature and see whether this idea, which was mainly a title, has any possibility. And as we sit here, Ken will tell you whether he's already put these ideas out. If so, I've been preempted and I'll have to come up with a new body of content for this title. And if he doesn't shake his head in too much disagreement, and you can check the other parts of the panel, then maybe there's something that needs to be written. Because at this point, this article is the title and the notes that I've been adjusting as I listen to these fine presentations. So what is my prediction? It's very difficult. This is a Kuhn book. It's not a lawyer. It's very difficult to predict the paradigm shift. But it's very exciting to be the first one that said it's already here. And when you have some time to look back on this, you will realize we've made this shift. And I see some prediction from Professor Gross, but I'm going to be a bit more aggressive in my suggestion about the paradigm shift, and I'm going to bring it back to the law to say, despite what you've heard about whether it's possible that the law can handle fully automatic weapons, I predict that in a matter of years that the law will require to take humans out of the loop, building on some of what Professor Gross said. But let's go back in time. I don't know if anyone's as old as I am here. I hope not. Maybe somebody's older. But there was a time where people in elevators, they were operated by human beings. And in Washington, D.C., there are still some old-fashioned elevators. And when you go into that elevator, I think you'll have my reaction. You're somewhat uncomfortable about it. So why do I have this human doing this? What happens if the human wants to crash the elevator? There's something quaint, old-fashioned, a human in the loop, but we don't like it. We would much rather have that control. Now we have some control, but after we push the button, we seem to be happy when we put it into the control of Otis the manufacturer of the elevator. This is, in some sense, a fully autonomous system that we accept. And I believe, I've been digging. I can't do much research, so I turn to my research assistants. They haven't found the cases, but I believe there'll be tort cases that may say it is a breach of duty of care to have a human operating that elevator. Imagine if the elevator does crash and people are injured, you can rest assured that someone will bring a lawsuit. And it's one way of testing the legality of a human rather than a fully autonomous system. Now you've heard an inventory of some of the areas where we're making progress in technology. So I'll go back to the Google cars that's been mentioned in both areas, but let me come up with 2 examples that haven't been mentioned so far. And I know this is out there, but as the last person, it's difficult to come up with something original. So think about Big Blue, chess players. I don't know if you followed Kasparov versus the program. It was exciting. I think they even had something on PBS about it. When you can get chess on public television, you're doing a good job. Now, Kasparov beat the computer the first time, and they talked to him about how could you beat the computer, and it was mystical talk about how he used the logic of the computer against him, that he wouldn't spend time chasing down patterns or possibilities that the computer did. And then as we follow Kasparov, he can't beat Big Blue. Big Blue beats humans. We've lost. You cannot beat the computer. Then you're going to challenge perhaps the analogy of whether these decisions in the battlefield, whether they are like playing chess. But chess is something more complicated than operating an elevator. Let's explore that. And we're now at the point to confirm that technology is better than we are in some areas. We are feeble. We are the frail link, to borrow phrases from the other presentations. One other area, when you get on a flight, do you check in the cockpit to make sure there's a pilot there? I like to get some wings if I can for my 10-year-old son, find someone that will talk to me and smile back. There are so few out there. Smile, everybody. I know. Come on. You need windows in this law school. This is one criticism I have, Dean. You need windows in these rooms. But when you're there,
we'd be happy to accept donations for that purpose.
Well, maybe if Professor Gross gives up that chair that he's going to take at Harvard. But yes, I'll give. You want a human being. It makes you more comfortable. But if you sat there and watched how that plane was operated, it is very automatic. They put it on automatic pilot. Now, why do you have the pilots in there? They tell you in case we get into some situation, we need this person that's trained. Part of it is for insurance purposes. It's been in Wired magazine, is that the airlines say, we're at the point, maybe with cargo flights, that we could have these planes fly themselves, but we haven't thought through all the issues. And I'll come back to that. The military has a different approach in dealing with liability. Remember, sovereign immunity there, it's a different setting. So those are the areas, and now I'd like to pick up on what Professor Gross said about Google cars. I mean, I agree with him. Soon they will be safer. The Google car will be safer than any of you driving. I mean, you're out there on the road. Look at some of the other drivers. Texting, they may be drunk, they may be stoned, they're talking to the kids in the back. I would much prefer to take my chances with the Google car. It's not 100%, but some of you driving, you frighten me even more. I mean, right today, I think I'd rather take my chances with Google cars. And out of that comes a revelation as we apply it to these systems in warfare. We don't, in the body of laws that we're talking about, this is laws of armed conflict. But you could have other bodies of law that you want to apply to armed drones. You could say, I want a human rights model, due process. I'm going to approach it in a self-defense framework. This is much of Ken Anderson's work. Whatever model you pick, I've said there is a convergence toward a rule of reason. Now, we were on another panel, and I think I shocked Ken by saying, I don't care so much about these rules. I don't understand them. But what I do understand is that we want a rule of reason. We want the application of force to be reasonable. This is why you can't kill civilians indiscriminately. You can't target civilians, but we accept that civilians may be killed. And we have to define what is a civilian, what body of armed conflict we're in, but you don't expect 100% performance from humans, so why would you expect it from fully automatic systems? So there's going to be a shift that if the technology, and we depend on if the technology is significantly better than humans, I think it's only a matter of years before we have to come to the conclusion, whether it's laws of armed conflict, human rights, or self-defense, that the law requires a human to be out of the loop. And I'm testing these ideas, and I tested it one time before, and I'm reminded of some of what Professor Gross says about indoctrination in the military. Now, I was privileged to be invited, it was a year ago, to make a presentation at U.S. Central Command's forward operating base in Doha, Qatar. And I was selected because I had a clearance before, and they wanted someone who had clever ideas, but not too clever, and somebody that knew the protocols of dealing with the government. So I got invited. This was great. To be there on the base, people serving us, and the theme of the conference was transitions. And they were talking about transitions out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but a large part of the discussion was about the drones and the legal issues that are there. And I have this habit, and I apologize to I get invited, I'm happy to be here at Minnesota. I'd like to poke at the people that have invited me there. And I poked at these JAGs from the various services, and I put forward this idea that the law will require. And you could see there is an emotional reaction because of all their training. Humans. It's in the warrior ethos. And I took the bobbing and weaving, I took my hits, and I had my hands up like this, like another boxer of a time, Muhammad Ali. Remember, when you put your hands up for 11 rounds, you don't want to get knocked out in the 12th round. I mean, what would be the point then? You put them up to protect yourself to do hopefully well in the 13th, 14th, or 15th round. So when they calmed down, then we started to analyze the laws of war and say, well, what is it that you say violates the laws of war? When it's tied to the technology, and some of them were techies and saying, you might be right. It may be a matter of years or decades, but I don't think it's going to be 100 years where we have to deal with the possibility. And then out of that came, in the literature, and this is not law literature, is two approaches to dealing with this problem if you agree with me that it's already here. One is that we're at the cutting edge, is if we think this is going to be a problem, if it's going to be the bad scenarios of those sci-fi movies, perhaps what you do is say, let's ban them, in the way that we've tried to ban weapons in space. Let's get out in front and say we don't want to deal with this. I don't know, I'm agnostic on that. Then the other approach is if we think it's here, if we think it's possible within the law, then what are the secondary rules? And if we're troubled about these systems, it may reveal maybe an underlying problem with how loose these bodies of law are. I mean, we've done the scenarios. When we talk about civilian casualties, you will not get any of the experts to give you a number on how many can be killed. It's all tied, it's military necessity, that because the logic runs out. I'll close with a scenario with all of you, but I want to go back to logic. Computers, it's ones and zeros. So ask yourselves, if the policymaker said, I want to go right to the line of legality, do we have enough precision in the laws of war that you can give it to a programmer? Because the computer wants to do the ones and zeros. That's the core of programming. Or will the computer then reveal to us this big gap? The cliff at which the law runs, it runs out. It doesn't handle these issues. Does it reveal a deep imprecision? So here's my scenario, and then I close. Now let's imagine that Ayman Zawahiri has been reading all the writings of the professors here, excluding mine, because I've told Ayman, don't waste your time. And he's become an expert on the laws of war. He decides that he's going to adopt Afghan boys, 10, 11 years old. And they don't know who he is. They know he's a doctor, an Egyptian doctor. He has some international activity. And he has a boy that he takes with him at all times. And you have as close as you can get in certainty, 99.9% certainty that it is Ayman in the screen. You're targeting, and you still have a human in the loop. And then they'll go to the lawyers and they say, it's Ayman, but he's got a kid. Can we kill him? Or do we have to wait? As a matter of law, we may not have another opportunity. I think by the reaction, most of us are going to say, well, yes, one kid. I mean, law professors love these scenarios. One kid is fine. Ken?
Ken closes his mouth. And, it can't be answered in this kind of thing, but of course, Collateral damage is lawful.
Well, hold all the other things equal, so we're going to focus on the level of collateral damage. So and we're now going into the discussion portion. So it's 1. Two, and this is the difficulty with policymakers that expect the lawyers to go right up to that point. And in many of the discussions, those big discussions that we like in symposia, the lawyers are told to leave. We don't need your advice on policy. We've read enough philosophy ourselves. We want a specific answer. Remember, the conferences before was, can we do this to a human being short of the definition of torture? We believe that you can get information. So we don't care about your view on the policy or the effectiveness. We want an answer from you, the Office of Legal Counsel. May I take someone and strap him to a board? Put plastic or a towel over his mouth. Does this fit the definition of severe psychological pain or severe physical pain? Those are tough questions. Then we assume that waterboarding, some of us, meets the definition. Then you'll move on to a new set of questions. Can I keep a human being up for 1 day? 2 days, 3 days? I mean, this is the difficulty. It's in any areas. And I remind us not to assume that there is more objectivity to the standard. And what I like about this topic is that it gets us to present or confront our imperfections as people making decisions and the imperfections that are built in the law, and for us to accept our humility that we are not expecting any of us to perform to 100%, and we shouldn't hold computers to the same standard.
Well, my thanks to all of our panelists, and I'm going to try and start some discussion going, and then we'll turn it over to you all for questions in just a few minutes. So I'm looking for areas of disagreement among our panelists, and not finding a huge disagreement, but let me ask a little bit about this question of regulation and whether the law of war as it stands is adequate for technology as it has already developed, and whether you see changes coming in the very near future. And I take Ken's point that it's hard for us to predict what's going to happen 10 years down the road, much less 20 or 40 or more. But looking just ahead to what's already in the pipeline, do we need changes in the law of war as it stands? Historically, the development of new technology has always been followed by changes to the law of war, new regulation, rather than the other way around. So you develop the crossbow, and there are efforts to ban it in the 12th century, but they follow the development of the crossbow and the way it changes the conduct of warfare. So, and mindful of John's point that there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of gray in the law of war, very hard to apply in particular situations. We've got general principles about distinction and proportionality. Do we need to change the law of war? Should we try and regulate prospectively? There are those who would like to ban autonomous weapon systems already. And bearing in mind that we're only one country developing these systems, there are many others. Are there changes that we should be thinking about right now?
Yes. I think that at the level of the general principles and the sort of fundamental bases of the laws of war, so distinction, proportionality, these kinds of things are not going to change. They are going to be the sort of fundamental touchstones for what we do. But you notice how all three of us wind up immediately approaching these things, and it's very much from a sort of casuistical, case-by-case scenario. It's very much a sort of reasoning by analogy and saying, how does the elevator wind up resembling the Google car, resemble these kinds of technologies? And which is why, John, I think you need to take these notes and get writing, because these are new areas in the sense of the application of these things, and the way that we will proceed will be by these sort of analogical reasonings. Is this feature more like that feature that we thought was okay? Is there some difference about it? And that kind of granular movement forward will depend in part on the granular incremental changes in the technologies themselves. And at the same time is going to depend on these sort of ways in which we very closely look at the changes from one to the next and see whether it seems to change our sense of what it means under principles of discrimination, proportionality, and so on. So I think that some of these things will crystallize into new rules that may have a long timeline in the sense that many of the rules that we have crystallized around kinetic weapons that arose, as with artillery and other sorts of things in the 19th century, and for land warfare are fully applicable today. And yet the development of air power, the development of other kinds of technologies also caused alterations. The development of the submarine, these kinds of things did wind up producing changes in the rules. And I think that that process will happen, that we will take these general principles, we'll start applying them to concrete systems. Some of these things will crystallize into rules of robots the way that we have rules for kinetic weapons. But they will not necessarily be immutable either over time in the same way that things like the development of the airplane and things like that also altered these things. I also would add that we have to be very, very careful in thinking about the ways in which we move to ban weapons in this context. Most of the principles that have been put out for calling for a ban on autonomous weapons, I think would wind up banning Google cars, meaning that Google cars wind up taking lethal decisions in their programming about how to deal with other cars on the road, how to do things like change lanes, move into intersections, many, many discrete individual decisions, many of which are not just things that might have lethal consequences, but are things which are actually aggressively moving on other cars, because that's part of the nature of driving. And so one has got to be very careful that if one is saying, if it's in the weapons area, it's bad. I think that it's very much what both Oren and John said, that we are going to wind up finding ourselves in a position that if things like Google cars wind up working out the way that they, I think, probably will wind up working out, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, I think that people, the next generation or two, will wind up looking, and it will not occur to them, exactly as Oren said, to believe that one should have the human in the loop in something where clearly the machine has proven that it does it better. I think that they will find that a genuinely bizarre idea, and probably rightly so. And in that sense, I just want to add one thing about the sci-fi thing, because as I was listening to Oren describe scenarios that I was looking at the audience and thinking the audience is thinking these are sci-fi, thoughts controlling this and all these sort of various cyborg scenarios. And I just realized that having spent some time in this area, they don't really seem like sci-fi to me. So we're actually sort of on the same page, that when I think of the sci-fi scenario, I really am thinking about investing too much pop culture would be sort of closer into it.
So I want to, second Ken on several issues. We are not, when I started by saying that we are kind of facing a new revolution, I have no doubt, and we have literature on this, but just project yourself back to the era before the Industrial Revolution, or the era before the Internet Revolution, and how people then thought about what's coming, right? Whether it's the steam engine, whether it's then later on the invention of cars. And there were calls then to ban, to prohibit. This technology is getting out of hand. And to a large extent, I think that both Ken and John are exactly right. In a few years from now, kids already say, "Wow, you watch TV in 2D? What was that? You actually needed phones maybe to communicate? You didn't." Things that we do not necessarily know, and on this I agree with John about the incrementalism, because we don't know, right, how these things are going to develop. There is fear. Things are scary because they are unfamiliar to us, right? But this is where we're moving. Now, I don't think that, and again, I agree here with Ken, that the basic rules need to change. Rules such as proportionality, rules such as discrimination. You cannot directly target civilians. These rules have withstood the test of time. They should not be chucked out the window just because we are now using, or we are going to use, autonomous weapon systems. But we also need to understand that those rules, right, are used And when the commanders sit with the lawyers in the room and saying, well, there is one child or two children or three children, lawyers today, right, and commanders today need to make those decisions. Do you fire or do you let go? Right? And many times, the information that we have currently is a skewed information, is partial information, right, about all of these things. And when you add technology, technology is not a panacea. Right? But when you add more technology, that means that your information may be a better information, that your decision horizons might shift and change. And these are things that we also need to understand. We can talk about robots as 100% foolproof. If that's what we think that robots should be, then they're not going to be put on the ground. But if we think about, well, a robot's going to be safer, a robot's going to be more compliant with the laws of war, assuming we can program them, than human beings, if that's the test, then the answer, at least in some area, is clearly yes. They will be. Now, with respect to ban, two things that I will say about ban. Number one, again, as I said, I think that train has left the station. Whether it's because the United States is not the only country playing in this field, and whether because the technology is already out there, right? Whether it's because of the dual use issues, right? And whether it is because of, think about the following scenario, since we mentioned scenarios. Think about a little robot called PackBot, right? Which is a platform. It's a robot on wheels and track. And this robot is a platform. It's currently still tethered. I mean, it's teleoperated by an individual. But let's assume it's autonomous. Right? And you can basically say, okay, this robot will now carry ammunition, will carry medical supplies into the battlefield. Should that be banned? So they said, probably not. Right? We have all those big dog robots that are supposed to carry stuff for soldiers. There's no reason. It's basically like a truck. But the same PackBot can also be mounted with a machine gun. Now, are you going to ban this? And if so, if you say to yourself, yes, the answer is I'm going to ban this. What is it exactly that you ban? Do you ban the deployment of that platform? Do you ban the deployment of the machine gun, which is an available, legitimate weapon in warfare? Do you ban the combination?
So let me ask one other question. Let me ask one other question, ask for short answers, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for their questions. I just want to ask about the psychology of war. You hear a lot about, or you hear a lot of claims made that because it is possible to kill remotely, that you have people sitting in Langley or in Nevada or whatever operating drones from thousands of miles away, and because the U.S. government can deploy force with much less risk and sometimes no risk to its own personnel, it makes it easier to engage in the use of force in the first place. And I'd like your reactions as to whether the psychology with which we make decisions about whether to use force in the first instance are changing and will change as a result of development of robotics and technology, or whether this isn't something we really need to worry about. John?
We don't know the answer. And we don't have, in my view, an adequate point of reference, because there's an assumption that we know the psychology of killing for a Marine on the ground in Afghanistan. Now, we can hear there are more of these people there. We have reporters that go there, but I don't know that there's been enough study on this. We're talking about the psychology of killing. And then this is a subcategory, the psychology of killing from a remote location, from a trailer, whether it's in the desert in Arizona or in Nevada. And I think we need to be careful about even listening to law professors on this subject, because law professors, if they admit it, their sources are going to be the Washington Post and the New York Times. And if those reporters admit it, they're going to say that their sources are limited. They were given access to some of the people that are operating those autonomous systems for a reason. There's a 60 Minutes episode at Creech Air Force Base the Department of Defense, for its own reasons, decided to allow people there. But we don't know about the other facilities. But it is a great area. I don't know that it's for legal research, but we have to turn to the social scientists. Or if you know people that have operated these, send me an email. I'd love to spend time and talk to them. And in that setting, I promise to keep my mouth shut and listen to what they're saying about what is it like to go to work that day, to go into a place and watch on a screen and make a decision to kill someone, and what is it like to see some of your colleagues on the ground and you couldn't get the drone there in time. It's new issues that are there and great questions, but I don't know. And I want to make clear to Ken Anderson, my fast in terms of legal literature has ended today, and my first act of going to the legal literature is to read Ken's article on the condition that he sends me one of those reprints autographed, and it says, to my friend or my student, John Radsan, make me proud.
Wow. Let me set and be very brief. I agree with John. We don't actually have a lot of information about what that process is like, although we do have actually some. But more importantly about the psychological process of operating weapons goes to something, again, that both John and Oren have pointed out quite correctly, which is very, very few of our warriors are actually out there pulling the trigger at identified targets that they are actually looking at. That's simply not how modern warfare works. What we do have a vast amount of experience is what happens when you fire the cruise missile when you are sitting at a console in the bowels of a ship that's hundreds or 1,000 miles away and firing that missile, and your remoteness from the target, if anything, is vastly more than somebody who is operating the drone. When they talk about the drone operators and psychological effects of this, one of the features about that is that these guys are piloting the thing and they are engaged in surveillance. The decisions to decide to kill somebody are coming from far away. They're coming from squads of lawyers and intel people and the rest, who are then making a determination that they've decided to move this person up the list to make them a target for actual firing a weapon. And those decisions are all being made elsewhere. The people that are actually flying the thing around and engaging in the surveillance, the indications are that they're actually much more involved with these people than almost any other form of weapons operator, because of the fact that they're sitting and watching them for weeks and weeks and weeks and months on end in some cases. And then an order comes through and directs them that they will finally target a weapon. That's vastly more involved with the target than almost any other form of targeting that's engaged in. So if one's talking about sort of those kind of psychological elements, I think that one has got to be very careful about thinking of remoteness in that sense. And the other feature about remoteness of drones is we should not think of these things as either sort of global Ronin flying around the world operated at halfway around the planet. They are much more in terms of their operations like a craft on an aircraft carrier. They require basing, which is relatively close to where they're flying around. They require hundreds of people in order to maintain them and keep them up in the air, who've got to be where the physical machine is located. They are not this sort of thing which is just sort of sent from, as though from the planet Mars, to come in and sort of do this global hit. And so it's very important not to invest too much in the fact that the actual operator may be in Creech. And then finally, the drone's effectiveness is less a function of its ability to engage in surveillance itself than to think of it as being the final kinetic tip of the spear of what in fact is a vast intelligence operation that backs it up in order to ensure that it actually has somebody and someplace to target. Its effectiveness in Pakistan has been almost entirely on account of the CIA's ability to create ground-level intelligence networks that do not rely on the Pakistani intelligence services to independently gather intelligence on the ground in order to identify people that might become targets in the first place. That process is what makes it most effective, and yet virtually none of that is seen if one focuses merely on the technology at the sort of end, at the point at which a weapon is fired.
So we talked about the distancing and weapons as creating a distance, and one of the reasons for that, certainly one of the modern reasons, is that study after study shows that most soldiers in wars actually try not to kill. Most soldiers, and there have been studies on this in Vietnam, there have been studies on this in other war zones, have shot the weapons hoping or trying actually not to kill an enemy target, especially when the target is there, when you see. So I'm sure that most of you saw Lincoln, and when I saw it, at least half of the audience averted their eyes when there's this opening scene and kind of the crushing of a soldier into the mud. It's brutal, right? Human beings are not killing machines, by and large. Most of us are not killing machines. It becomes easier, that's the fear, it becomes easier to kill somebody when it's done from far away. But again, and I want to emphasize this point, most mechanisms, most weapons that we already have allow us this killing from far away, whether it's artillery or, if you followed the reports about the sniper that was killed by a former military in Texas in a shooting range, and you looked at this, he's endowed with 160 or 225 kills, depends on who you talk to. At least one of the kills, or I think the longest kill that he did with his sniper rifle was 1.5 miles away. This is not something that is there. You still see the target, but it's far away. When you fire artillery, indirect line of fire, you don't see what you hit. When you're a fighter pilot and you hover over a target, if you actually hover over a target, even that is anachronistic because you actually don't need to be above the target. You can be 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away when you fire the weapon. You probably don't see, and if you see those images that we see frequently on CNN. They don't mean anything. When you operate the systems that we currently have, and these are just the beginning, and you see those really high definition and increasingly better definition images of the before and the after of your own actions, to some extent, despite the fact that physically you may be farther away, there's also something that brings you closer, right? The proximity to your actual target and what that actually does to you. So on the one hand, there might be an easiness, right, in firing when you are not at risk. But there's also a cost to that we need to take into consideration.
If I'll keep it brief, 30 to a minute. I agree with all the summaries about the technology, but I think there's one area that we should emphasize. And Professor Gross was talking about, in describing military people, that they say, well, we can keep the human in the loop because they're the people that program the system. I believe even that is going to break down. I've been following the literature in the scientific fields, and this is one of the aspects of Big Blue, of these sophisticated systems that are replicating thinking, is that they can program themselves. They are self-programming. So the human may be in the loop at the initial stage, but the computer will take over. It will learn from its mistakes. We're trying to figure out what is it that's effective about humans. Can we reduce it to ones and zeros? If so, if we want more efficiency, we give it to the computer. What that does is it gets us to confront a very basic question, which is what is it to be human? What is so special about being human? Why do we have this duality between humans and machines? And I'll close with something very optimistic, is that part of being human is our illogic, that we're not subjected to ones and zeros. Think of your mother or father. Think of selflessness. The computer won't do that. It won't understand that. Try to program something like love or respect for a computer. And that's where I believe that's the one niche where we're different, is that we're not going to be reduced to those ones and zeros, and we should applaud ourselves for that, and we have to be careful. That's why these topics, they start to break down law. It gets us into philosophy, morality, and that's why there are lots of questions out there, Dean.
Okay, floor is open for questions. Second row there.
I was going to say a few minutes ago that absent in this discussion, obviously, was the human, but specifically the target. And I think it's kind of an antiseptic view of war, where sanctions and these things are seen as, not actually harming anybody. And maybe we just target the other side's robot. But I think anybody who studied war understands the law of unintended consequences. Al-Qaeda said one of the reasons they attacked, the United States was because of the 500,000 uncontested by Madeleine Albright children that died as a result of the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s. At the end there, you did start talking about the psychology of war, and I think a discussion such as this should never avoid that as part of this, because although popular mechanics maybe have fascinating discussions on robots, in war you cannot take that out because there may be, again, this wide range of unintended consequences. For all we know, the Newtown shooter, who was an avid aficionado of the military, in his sick mind, acted out what he saw as an attack, which is pretty similar, actually, on the Newtown school to what we have in the news all the time about what we're doing in various countries. And so I guess my point is, again, perhaps you might want to discuss maybe the other unintended consequences. There's PTSD of the people targeting people and killing them and whatnot, but maybe even a larger psychological effect upon our society in itself when we've taken killing into such an abstract form that we no longer feel any sense of guilt about it and the effect that may have upon individuals within our own society. And one other thing, we may harden our military targets, but like Al-Qaeda said, if they had F-15s, they would attack our military, but they don't, and so therefore they attack our civilians. So maybe are we opening up our own civilian population to much greater risk by creating these hardened targets that can kill at leisure with the world pretty much as a shooting gallery?
Anyone want to respond on unintended consequences or psychology?
I guess I'd leave that as a statement, I think.
Yeah. I've got one. I'll be brief. And it's another note to the paper. I think you're onto something about how this plays on the other side. So let's go to Pakistan. Two scenarios. We have a use of a killer drone. Scenario number one was autonomous targeting, and we killed one civilian. We got the target, we killed one civilian. And then another scenario is a human being was in the loop, human being all along in the targeting decision. It wasn't fully automatic, and we killed 10 civilians. Now, if you're talking about loss of life, well, this scenario is far worse, but I think you're tapped into the psychology, especially of our adversaries that may not have it. I believe, based on my sense of psychology, that people would be more outraged about the one because a computer did it rather than the 10. And there's something true about our assessment of the psychology, but I think there's something also irrational about that. I mean, there will be more of a protest in Pakistan if they find out that the one was killed by a fully automatic system. And it plays into the negative aspects of the science fiction. And remember, right now, even with the drones, the counterinsurgency aspect is the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They said the Americans they're not courageous. They won't get down on the ground and fight us. And it plays into the psychology, but then you can relate it to this. Are we supposed to give up our cruise missiles, our F-16s? We've already done our best to protect our soldiers and to kill the enemy and to try to discriminate between the enemy and those that are civilians.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions and not a lot of time, so please keep your questions very brief, no statements, just questions in the back.
I would respectfully suggest that the idea of fully automatic battlefields and weapons is not novel, that we've had it with landmines and other mines for a long time. In my mind, the more interesting question that I wish you academics would approach more is, regardless of futurism with possible, what's happening today? How does the rule of law apply today to what's being done with drones? Because when I was a kid growing up, the thought that the CIA might have targeted Fidel Castro was sort of scandalous. Maybe it was okay, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But nowadays, because we can, these drones are permitting us to sort of target people in Yemen, and I'm not saying that they're good people and shouldn't die. All I know is that these are questions of law in application to the present battlefield where human beings are making decisions. Are events going too fast for the applicability of legal principles that 50 years ago it was just understood we didn't assassinate people, and now it's understood we do. And that's, in my mind, the real issue of the modern battlefield, not sophisticated landmines.
Okay. Responses? That's a big topic.
Well, sir, we did try to, that's in the public record, we did try to kill Castro. We weren't very good at it. And then only half in jest. Would you prefer that we have the Israelis track down the person and kill him in a hotel room? Once you've gone into the possibility of the state tracking people down and killing them, then we're talking about differences in approach. And I think that the panel was told to focus on the robotics, but there are plenty of panels about the legal issues related to armed drones. I know Ken has probably been on 100, Oren's probably been on 101.
Okay. Yes, gentleman in the third from the back row, yeah.
Not to be a fatalist or alarmist, but it seems to make sense that it's for incremental changes to promote efficiency. As you go down this path, how do you not foresee any sort of like Terminator scenario, or what can be done ethically to incorporate some sort of safeguards between now and that future? Because to assuage certain people into accepting, or for society to accept this sort of automation of the battlefield, how do you incorporate safeguards?
So first of all, you mentioned the ethical problem, and we need even that to kind of be a bit more nuanced. So there are several ethical issues here, right? So there are the ethical considerations of those who involved in creating, right, the robotic revolution, right? What you cannot do, what you should and shouldn't do. Then there's the ethics of the robots themselves, right? So what rules are programmed into the robot that is deployed in battle? What are the rules that are programmed into the robot that walks around in the hospital and is involved in surgeries or what have you, right? So there are two types of issues that we need to think about, and what are the ethical issues for us as a society dealing with this. But I want to maybe go back to kind of to the mechanisms. I think that this is very much, right, part of the conversation that needs to happen, right? Rather than say, okay, those things are not going to happen, which is clearly, right, unrealistic. We need to think about, okay, if robots are in fact going to be deployed, other things, right, other than trying to program the laws of armed conflict. How do we program the laws of armed conflict? In which I think lawyers and programmers and manufacturers will need to work together hand in hand, and ethicists, right? Will need to work together hand in hand to see how we make this, move this forward. We need to think about, for example, what default rules would you program a robot? So for example, with robotics, you can do things that you cannot do with human beings. To give you one example, you can program, whether it's desirable or not, it's a question that needs to be asked. You can program a robot to say, for example, never shoot first. Only shoot in response. Clearly, this is not something that you can tell a soldier. Right? If you feel that your life is in danger, you can and you would be expected to shoot first and not wait. Right? Robots, you can say that. You can actually program, never shoot first. You can have some sort of a kill switch. Right, automatic. Now, of course, there can be malfunctions. Right, there can be malfunctions in current hardware that we have. But this is the type of things that we also need to think about, kind of in the nitty-gritty details of what it is that we want to put forward.
Yes, woman in the back.
You gave an interesting answer to that, but I want to dig even further. We're talking about the law crystallizing in this area. We're talking about banning certain autonomous weapons. We're talking about regulating the use of dual-use technology. What shape, what is the nature of the regulation as you see it happening in I don't know, the next decade maybe? How is the law actually going to regulate this? What shape is the regulation going to take? What is the nature of such regulation going to take? So are we talking about a treaty? Because actually states could perhaps regulate this. Or are we talking about something else? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
I don't think, and I'll be interested to hear Ken's response to this, I don't think that, treaty or a state, you present it as almost like mutually exclusive, and I don't think that's the case. If you think, for example, okay, Google car has been now mentioned by all of us, so I'll go back to Google car, all right? The beginning of regulation is done on a state basis, local basis. If, of course, the Google car rises to prominence, we can anticipate that there might be national regulation and eventually international regulation, right? So it can well be that you will have both a bottom-up and top-down sorts of regulation. Now, again, regulation, we cannot look at regulation as a monolith, right? There is the issue of responsibility, right? At the end of this, who's going to be responsible for things? Criminal regulation. There's the ex ante, the front end regulation, right? Do you allow such systems to be deployed? And if so, are the rules that, you know, if you have a weapons review, weapons legal review teams, what do they need to check? The same way that every modern army now has, because it has the obligation under international law to review and to approve weapons before they are deployed, right? New weapons, to see whether or not they are actually compatible with the laws of war, assuming we treat those things as weapons, right? The same type of rules and regulations will be applied.
I guess I would add to that two things. One is that I wouldn't rule out the possibility of some form of regulatory treaty, but I think that it would be the last step of a very long process lasting many decades if one would like to see a treaty that has any actual purchase on the issue. And that prior to that point, what we will see is two different kinds of activities. One will be efforts by leading states that do take an interest in the laws of war in some real way. Attempting to use the process of weapons review and these kinds of processes in order to essentially put out what amount to sort of best practices for, say, these are the standards to which we're committed in the sort of granular engineering process. So in other words, sure, it's international standards, but they have to be brought down to individual cases, and this is what we think sort of the best practices in this particular thing are. We're willing to put them out for others and invite others to agree, disagree, adapt them, adopt them, but some form of sort of informal dialogue between leading national actors that does that. And the second will be that countries will wind up deploying systems that at least the United States will not think are legal in the least. An example of this will be that somebody will come along with an autonomous system that does the following. It will simply identify sources of fire, identify where they are, and automatically fire back. And that, in the U.S. view, will not be a legal system because although it is able in one sense to discriminate in the sense of identifying something which is lawful to shoot at, it will have no capacity to be able to look at whether there are civilians in the area, proportionality, collateral damage, any of those issues. The United States would regard that as an unlawful system if it were automated in that way with no human intervening in that process. But I'm pretty certain that somebody will wind up deploying exactly that kind of system down the road. And in many respects, the questions of regulation will wind up turning, the international questions of regulation will wind up turning to be, how do the countries that are not willing to deploy that kind of system and do wind up regarding it illegal, how do they respond when somebody else does deploy that kind of system? And I think that many of the regulatory questions will actually be a question of how countries respond to other folks' deployment of systems that pretty clearly don't meet the international standard.
Well, on that happy note, I think we're actually at the end of our time. So I'm regrettably going to cut off the discussion here. Our panelists will be around for a little bit. We have a break before the next session, so you might be able to catch them. If you have any particularly burning questions you want to ask them, please join me in thanking our